co-founder of Northshire Bookstore, Barb Morrow. And she's going to be taking us away and introduce the main author. So Barb, please take us away.
Okay, thank you so much, David. I'm so honored to be able to introduce Barbara Bonner to you this afternoon. Barbara and I have been fast friends for a number of years, sharing a devotion to Buddhist principles, as well as a love for the arts, good food, and honest communication. We first met when she presented her first book, Inspiring Generosity. Barbara has devoted her professional life to leadership roles in distinguished nonprofits. She has spoken widely on nonprofit management with a focus on the role of generosity in creating thriving institutions. A student of contemplative study and practice for many years, her books delve into the values central to her own life and work. In her new book, Inspiring Forgiveness, Barbara draws from the wisdom of poets, philosophers, and others who have found the path to forgiveness against all odds. We learn about the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Congressman John Lewis, and many others. To begin with, Barbara, can you talk a bit about the genesis of this book and how it is an outgrowth of the first two?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you. This is my fourth time with Northshire, and you've been so supportive to all my writing, and I'm so grateful. And I also have to give a shout out to all you've done during these difficult months, the ways in which Northshire and other independent bookstores have reached out to communities, bringing books into new positions in our lives during this time. It's really been just wonderful. So it's especially meaningful to be here now. So this book and my first two are really a testament to late in life surprise careers. I'd worked with philanthropists for most of my life. I'd worked on the subject of generosity, and through a series of wonderful flukes, the editor-in-chief at Wisdom knew that that was an interest 7 years ago, and that I was interested in writing on generosity, and said that they would be interested in publishing what I came up with. You know, sort of a fairy story in these world of hard-nosed publishers. I don't even have an agent. I'm a first-time unknown author, and they said, let's go for it. So that book did well, and 2 years later, they said, what else do you want to write about? And I said, well, courage has always been just central to my life. I'm so fascinated by people who live courageous lives. So then came Inspiring Courage. And then, 3 years ago, I guess, it happened one more time. And so that's how Inspiring Forgiveness was born. I think probably all three qualities have some outgrowth in, as you say, contemplative practice and a life of Buddhist study and practice. But forgiveness was particularly tricky. I found that people who were interested in the first two would say to me, so what are you working on? And you don't sort of want to talk about something you're working on. I'd sort of hem and haw, and they'd say, well, what's the subject? And then I'd kind of mutter, well, forgiveness. And invariably there'd be kind of an inhale, a look down, ooh, tough one. Nobody said, wow, I can't wait, how great that you're doing that. And that so interested me, really. I mean, I suppose it could have discouraged me, but it so interested me that this is such a tough subject for so many people. And as part of those conversations, people would then want to tell their own stories of something terrible that had happened to them, some terrible slight or painful experience. And they'd immediately make the leap to, and I'll never forgive him. I thought, now that's an interesting thing. You can talk about something terrible that happened to you and immediately link it up with, and I'll never forgive him. And so that intrigued me even more, really, in writing about it. I think it's because we, our big brains so love to be right and hang on to our opinions and to justify everything. And so the need to say I'll never forgive is really very common. So I wanted to explore that. And I explored it in this book, through 12 stories of people who really sort of go out on the edge and forgive what seems unforgivable. In the first two books, I did stories of people who personify those qualities in very beautiful ways. In this book, I wanted to make it a little bit tougher and present people who were really up against it and were able to summon up qualities of compassion in situations that most of us think we couldn't possibly. And my goal was really simply that I hope at some point in the future, after reading the book, someone can be in a tough situation and can think back to one of those stories and think, oh yes, I remember. Maybe I could just try that on for size. Let's see how that might work. You know, compassion is always available to us, but we do forget. So that's really the genesis of the book, in a very long-winded way, I'm afraid.
No, not at all. Can you tell us a bit more about your background and the aha moment that led you to meditation? I love this story.
Oh my goodness. There really was nothing in my background growing up in Central Ohio, sort of a classic Episcopalian family. No real religion in my life at all. But like many people, I think in very difficult times, we do turn to practices which surprise us. And I found myself in a very difficult summer in my life going to a yoga retreat at Kripalu here in the Berkshires. And did a week of yoga, and the husband of the woman who was doing the yoga retreat was the head priest of the San Francisco Zen Center. And he'd been sort of tagging along for the week, and he took me aside and he said, you know, next week I'm doing a whole week on Zen meditation, and I think you'd really enjoy it. And of course, I just squealed on the brakes. I said, not possibly, that sounds terrifying, and I'm not cut out for this at all. I appreciate your interest, but But he prevailed. And this was Edward S.B. Brown, very famous Zen monk and writer, chef, actually. And so I stayed, and Ed worked with me that week, but it didn't take much work. The first night with his instructions to simply sit down, I felt on that cushion, really, as you say, an aha moment of, oh my goodness. Anything sounds sort of melodramatic, but really a sense of sort of coming home and, yes, I understand this. This is, I can do this. And then it led to really 15 years since then of study, 2 trips to India, study with Bob Thurman in New York on Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Mountain Monastery, Tassajara in California, and then really my home base, which is Barre, Massachusetts. Hello, Barre. I think we have some friends from Barre on tonight, which has really been the life-changing place for me. So yeah, you just never know when those lightning bolts are going to strike, I guess. Thank you for asking that.
That's a wonderful story. You beautifully profiled John Lewis in your book. Today was his funeral, as we all know. Can you talk about his story and why he was so important to your subject of forgiveness?
It's very moving to be speaking tonight about John Lewis. You know, he was a hero to me for decades. And when I started to write the book, his story was the first one that I wanted to really research. Read everything he wrote, listened to all the speeches, was in touch with his wonderful staff. And so he's first in the book as somebody who simply lived forgiveness. His quote is, "Nonviolence and forgiveness are not just an idea, but a way of life for me." And that was absolutely true. And also he underlined something I hear very few people say, and that is that forgiveness is actually at the heart of the civil rights movement, the whole civil rights movement. It's not often said. I loved his quote in the Times today, really his last words: "Democracy is not a state, it is an act." I'm sure he would say forgiveness is not a state, it is an act. And probably love is not a state, it is an act. It was just ever present in his life. He was just the most wonderful story to tell first. And one of the things that I loved about it, to go a little farther with this great man, are two vignettes from his life, which really aren't often told. We know a lot about many of the things which happened to him, which he caused to have happen. But if we have time for them, I'll just tell these two.
Yeah.
One was at the Greyhound bus terminal in Rock Hill, South Carolina. This was in the Freedom Riders in '61. He was brutally beaten by a man named Albert Bigelow, a white supremacist, I think a member of the KKK. And it was decades later, in the early 90s, that Albert Bigelow read about John Lewis and realized who it was he had beaten that night. He hadn't known. He just beat a black man who was there protesting. And he had a complete crisis of conscience and took his son and went to Congress and asked for, went to Lewis's office and asked for a meeting with the congressman. And of course, John Lewis instantly offered forgiveness, and the meeting apparently ended in an extremely poignant hug. And Albert Bigelow's life was certainly changed by that. But that was an everyday occurrence in John Lewis's life. That's how he lived his life. And the other, just a story that just struck me as remarkable, was in his talking about George Wallace, the really dreadful, bigoted, white supremacist, segregationist who ran for president and had a political career. And it would be very hard to find anything kind to say about George Wallace, but at the end of his life, when he was very ill, he too had a crisis of conscience. And this is what, and he had a meeting with Lewis as well. And this is what Lewis wrote about that. George Wallace should be remembered for his capacity to change. And we are better as a nation because of our capacity to forgive and to acknowledge that our political leaders are human and largely a reflection of the social currents in the river of history. I can never forget what George Wallace said and did as governor, as a national leader, and as a political opportunist. But our ability to forgive serves a higher moral purpose in our society. Through genuine repentance and forgiveness, the soul of our nation is redeemed. George Wallace deserves to be remembered for his effort to redeem his soul, and in so doing mend the fabric of American society. That's just, it's not only forgiveness, it's generosity. Really remarkable, really remarkable. So it was a great honor to write about him, and like many, I've been immersed these 6 days in watching the ways we honor him. Yeah.
That's very moving. Yep. One of the other people you talk about or you write about is the Dalai Lama and how his life personifies forgiveness. Maybe you could talk a bit about that. I'm just in how he shows no bitterness, even though he has every reason to.
Every reason to. This is a man whose country has been taken over and destroyed, people murdered and tortured, monasteries burned, and yet he refuses to become bitter. He comes under a great deal of criticism for not actually having more anger. Many people know about the Dalai Lama's life, so maybe it might be actually more interesting to just talk about the story of a meeting that he had with a monk named Palden Gatso, who had been tortured and lived in the monasteries for many years before escaping to India from Tibet. And in a meeting with His Holiness, he asked him, was there a time you ever felt truly in danger? And Gyatso replied, the only time I truly felt at risk was when I felt in danger of losing compassion for my jailers. And that's something certainly that that sounds like both Lewis and the Dalai Lama, and also like Nelson Mandela.
Yeah. Is there someone else you would like to highlight of the 12 profiles that you wrote?
You know, it's really like asking about your kids.
Which is your favorite one, right?
I just became so close to them all, and the interviews were so wonderful. And of course, you know, people who are remarkable in living out certain virtues never think that they're remarkable. They just think they're living their lives. And it's only later when we get a chance to reflect and hear more that it takes on meaning. You might like it if I shared a few quotes from the book.
Sure, that would be great.
Some are short, some are long, but people seem to love that. And I must say that my reason for the book consists of quotes and stories and poems. Quite often books of quotes don't interest me that much, but my goal was really picking ones that would stick, that really offered inspiration. I think I'm a believer in transformation, and I think that it can happen through just the slightest remark can stick with you, and you suddenly later think, that. So that's what I tried to do in the quotes. But let me start with someone that you and I both love, Barbara, and that's the great Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron. And she speaks about self-forgiveness, which for many people is the very hardest of all. And she says, first we acknowledge what we feel: shame, revenge, embarrassment, remorse. Then we forgive ourselves for being human. Then, in the spirit of not wallowing in the pain, we let go and make a fresh start. We don't have to carry the burden with us anymore. We'll discover forgiveness as a natural expression of the open heart, an experience of our own basic goodness. The potential is inherent in every moment. Each moment is an opportunity to make a fresh start. I love that quote, and related to it in a different place, but very much like it. She says, we can let the circumstances of our lives harden us so that we become increasingly resentful and afraid, or we can let them soften us and make us kinder and more open to what scares us. We always have this choice. I think that's something that John Lewis would have said, that the Dalai Lama would agree with. Always a choice. There's always a choice. We're just non-reactive. They both echo something that this sounds very simplistic, but something that I've had on my refrigerator now for decades. And I look at it literally every morning as I go by. And this is from the wonderful Ralph Waldo Emerson. Finish each day and be done with it. You've done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities have crept in. Forget them as soon as you can. Tomorrow is a new day, and you shall begin it serenely with too high a spirit to be encumbered by your old nonsense. It's just, it's wonderful, isn't it? The underlying, the constant choice. We aren't stuck with our decisions. We aren't stuck with our burdens. Yeah. I love the quote from were you gonna say something? I love the quote from the poet and writer David White. To forgive is to put oneself in a larger gravitational field of experience than the one that first seemed to hurt us. In other words, pull back. Pull back. Don't get so attached to that one incident, that one remark. What is the whole situation, and what is it that we can bring to that in a new way? It's a lovely way of looking at it, I think. And then just some quick ones. I can forgive, but I cannot forget is another way of saying I will not forgive. Forgiveness ought to be like a canceled note, torn in two and burned up so that it can never be shown against one. He that cannot forgive others breaks the bridge over which he must pass himself, for every man needs to be forgiven. There's no point in burying the hatchet if you're going to put a marker on the site. True. Mark Twain, forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. From Nelson Mandela, famously, as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. It was also Nelson Mandela who, at his inauguration ceremony as president of South Africa, invited that jailer to come and sit in the VIP section. Something I think John Lewis probably would have done. And finally, the Bhagavad Gita, if you want to see the heroic, look at those who can love in return for hatred. If you want to see the brave, look at those who can forgive. So that's a smattering. There are 100 of them, but those are some favorites I thought you might like to hear tonight.
That's great. Can you talk a bit about how forgiveness frees one from being the victim?
We tend to like to hang on to that victimhood because it makes us feel so entitled. It makes us feel right. It makes us feel sort of justified. And for many people, I think it feels almost dangerous to give it up. Who would we be without this that we're carrying around with us? It's really, the 5th century Buddhist teacher Buddhaghosa says it's like carrying around a hot ember to hurl at the enemy and then realizing that you're the one who's getting burned. Let go of it all. Let go of it all and open yourself up to freedom of choice, and mostly let yourself open to a compassionate heart. And you will feel the freedom from victimization and victimhood. We really victimize ourselves. Nobody's victimizing us.
It's a lifelong journey, of course. How do you create the conditions? You've spoken a bit about this, and Pema Chodron certainly touches on this. How do you create the conditions for forgiveness to thrive?
It can be a very long process. I think that forgiveness gets sort of a bad rap in that we think of it as something which we just declare. Oh yes, I forgive you, which can also be a very false forgiveness just to get rid of it. You know, I forgive you, or an apology like that. But true forgiveness, I think if you create the conditions for bringing greater compassion into your life, it almost follows suit. You can't be a truly compassionate person without forgiveness taking a different place of importance in how you deal with people. Yeah.
Do you think during these difficult times that we're all facing that it's given people an opportunity to kind of open up and see some of what you're talking about, you know, maybe let go and perhaps forgive past things that have been weighing on them? Do you think this is an opportunity in a way?
I think it's both. You know, one of the reasons that I wanted to write on this subject is that the world is becoming increasingly angry and vengeful and intolerant. And so there's that side. And yet there's the side which isn't talked about as much, but I think all of us in facing a disease which can kill us, we all, whether we talk about it or not, we are acknowledging our own mortality in this time. Just by putting on a mask to go to the grocery, you're acknowledging that something is out there which actually can get you. And I think it makes people more reflective about the choices that they want to make. It certainly has reminded me in all the reading I've done about forgiveness and the role at the end of life. I end the book with two Buddhist monks who work with people at the end of their lives and talk about many others. And forgiveness over and over becomes the major subject that people want to talk about as they know that they're facing death. Mm-hmm. So both in forgiving people and in asking for forgiveness, but that becomes a crucial issue as they're really facing not only the end of their life, but sort of a summing up of what was important to them. So I do think I do think that it's on people's minds much more, certainly when they're in danger. You know, now we're sort of getting used to all this danger, but I think facing our own mortality definitely brings it to the forefront. Yeah.
Do you think we're all capable of forgiveness?
I believe in transformation. I believe it's always possible. It's certainly easy to look at some people in our contemporary world and think it would be impossible for them. But I like to believe it's always possible, and really why I read the George Wallace quote. But I think that some people are so wounded in their early lives, and really grow up to be so cruel and heartless that it's hard to imagine, but I won't give up on them. It's always possible.
You say somewhere in your book, imagine what might ensue if the nations of the world would embrace a 10% shift towards forgiveness. What would that look like?
Well, it looks like reaching out with an olive branch, maybe giving the benefit of the doubt a little bit. Mostly, I think it involves putting yourself in someone else's shoes. You know, we're so quick to defend our own position. Quite often we're right. But what does it feel like to be in the other person's shoes? If a nation could do that, it would be more possible to sit at the table and have a meaningful discussion. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily agree more, but it would be possible to have some kind of communication, open up possibilities. Really what we're just talking about, possibilities, always being at the crossroads of saying no or saying it might be possible.
Mm. Are we ready to hear a little bit of poetry? Or would you like to perhaps talk about somebody else that you've written about in the book? There's so many wonderful stories that you could tell.
Well, I'd love to do some poetry.
Let's do some poetry.
Poetry, and then if we have time left over, maybe I could just mention some of the stories. So I'd like to start with a sort of an unusual one, which is, to my mind, is really prose, but the author wrote it as a poem. This is a university professor in Mali, Professor Mugari. And I read it because I think it brings the issue of forgiveness just so sort of right front and center to us, and also because I think it would be something that children could understand in reading this. And we really don't teach forgiveness very well in this country. There are some cultures, diversion here. One of my stories is on the Amish. The Amish teach children about forgiveness from the beginning. It's something that we don't really have on our radar. Interests me. So this isn't a children's poem, but I say that because I think it would be accessible to them. So Mugari's poem, Forgiveness, a very good understanding of forgiveness. One of my teachers had each of us bring a clear plastic bag and a sack of potatoes. For every person we'd refused to forgive in our life, we were told to choose a potato. Write on it the name and date and put it in the plastic bag. Some of our bags, as you can imagine, were quite heavy. We were then told to carry this bag with us everywhere for 1 week, putting it beside our bed at night, on the car seat when driving, next to our desk at work. The hassle of lugging this around with us made it clear what a weight we were carrying spiritually, and how we had to pay attention to it all the time to not forget, and to keep leaving it in embarrassing places. Naturally, the condition of the potatoes deteriorated to a nasty slime. This was a great metaphor for the price we pay, for keeping our pain and heavy negativity. Too often we think of forgiveness as a gift we give to the other person. And while that's true, it clearly is also a gift for ourselves. So the next time you decide you can't forgive someone, ask yourself, isn't my bag heavy enough? Really lovely, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, on the theory that everybody needs a little bit of Mary Oliver every day, this is a short poem of hers I love called A Settlement. Look, it's spring, and last year's loose dust has turned into this soft willingness. The windflowers have come up trembling. Slowly the brackens are uplifting their curvaceous and pale bodies. The thrushes have come home, none less than filled with mystery, sorrow, happiness, music, ambition. And I'm walking out into all of this with nowhere to go and no task undertaken, but to turn the pages of this beautiful world over and over in the world of my mind. Therefore, dark past, I'm about to do it. I'm about to forgive you for everything. It's sort of perfect. And then a very tiny poem by William Carlos Williams, with which I end the book, very well known, very tiny, called This Is Just to Say. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold.
Yeah. Forgiveness takes all sorts of extremes, right? I mean, it can be very soft and humorous, and yet it's also very heavy and profound at the same time. Yeah.
And I think we practice at it, you know? With the plums, we're practicing at it for larger arenas of forgiveness. But it comes from the same place.
Yeah.
I do believe that.
You had said you might want to read a little bit from the introduction. Was that something you'd like to do?
Sure. There were maybe 2 pages that kind of are a good summing up of the book. Would that feel right at this moment?
I think it would.
We have time before questions. Great. True forgiveness asks us to open our hearts to those who have wounded us, offering the chance to them and to ourselves to begin again. It is a process, often a slow one, of trial and error, requiring practice and great patience. Yet even with the smallest shift in how we look at the offense or the offender, our orientation can change and leave us standing in a new place, with a heavy burden of blame and grudge holding ever so slightly lightened. As writer and life coach Marianne Glazer says, forgiving requires a counterintuitive response to the hurtful experience, relaxing the clenched fists, letting go and feeling the hurt while resisting the pull of armoring up. The effects of this shift can spread into all areas of our lives. It's this shift that can offer a path out of anger, blame, and the desire for revenge. A forgiving person, after all, creates a forgiving family and a forgiving community, and opens the possibility of a more forgiving world. Forgiving is an inner activity of the heart. Forgetting is not required, nor is action, nor apology. No one needs to know that it's occurred. Sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail, but we can always hold forgiveness as an intention. I love how Lewis Smedes describes it. If you're trying to forgive, even if you manage forgiving in fits and starts, if you forgive today and hate again tomorrow, and have to forgive again the day after, you're a forgiver. Most of us are amateurs. So what? In this game, nobody's an expert. We're all beginners. And finally, forgiveness can't be forced. We can create the conditions, as we talked about, likely to encourage its growth, but we can't will it into existence. It's something we usually have to ponder long and hard. For a few lucky ones, it arises spontaneously. We've talked about some of them. It can be a radical act of love, often quite bold. There's rarely applause. Those closest to us may disapprove or disagree with our new perspective. It can be risky. It's rarely necessary. This is an act we do for ourselves. It's also how we lift each other up. It's a way to fight cynicism and retain our hopes and dreams. As Robert Enright of the International Forgiveness Institute says, it is loving gentleness towards those who are stoning us. So that's just a part of the introduction.
That's lovely. There's actually an International Forgiveness Institute.
There is.
Oh, wow.
There are many forgiveness institutes and study groups actually who were forces in, for instance, Northern Ireland and Rwanda, Ferguson, Missouri. They really go in and bring together groups to sit together, and groups with varying opinions on the opposite sides, and bring them together. Wonderful.
Wonderful. Well, we certainly need these qualities in this day and age. My goodness, you know, if we could all just embody some of the things that you write about, it would be a more perfect world. We're not there. We're far from it.
That actually leads into a question that I had, if you guys don't mind. And I'd like to also say we're open to questions from the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat. But Barbara, this is, okay. So this is a thing I feel all the time. How can I possibly sort of feel forgiveness for certain people in, say, politics that I'm always so angry at? And, you know, I come up with, you know, I always have sort of made lists of, you know, well, if I had power, I would be a terrible person. And I knew I would do terrible things to these people that make me so mad. But as a practicing Buddhist and talking about forgiveness, how do I start sort of feeling empathy for politicians that I don't?
There are some pretty dreadful people at the helm out there. and I think there's nothing wrong with tremendous anger right now. We'd be crazy not to be angry at looking at the cruelty and injustice that we see around us. Well, first of all, I want to say, Daphne, and thank you for that question. I wrote 3 books on qualities which were important to me, but not that I'm an expert in. I believe in the power of intention and holding an intention for forgiveness, and that it's always possible. But justified anger right now is completely understandable. I think it propels us into action, and what we need is action right now. We need to change things pretty seriously. And that doesn't mean just sitting back and feeling all compassionate. We have to move forward, and we have to move forward forcefully. I mean, John Lewis would certainly say that. This was a man who embodied forgiveness, but he was also ferocious. He was a lion, and look what he did. And also I think we can't, justice and forgiveness are 2 completely different things. I think that there's a time for action, and it has to be the wisest action we can summon up, but there are times not to go soft.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we're waiting for audience members to put questions into the chat. I would also love to jump in. Barbara, you've written now about courage and generosity and forgiveness. Is there something that's in your mind as the next thing that you might want to explore?
Well, after my story about the people reacting to my talking about forgiveness, I don't know that I'd want to say anything about that. I think it's a nice little, as my publisher says, it's a nice little boxed set now. And I'm happy with these 3 because these 3 are so central to me. The thing is, once you really loved exploring a subject and writing about it, it's sort of hard to turn back. I can't imagine that I would ever really completely close up the computer. So I'm giving myself a couple of years of reading and thinking. And I usually find that when I go away from it all, it bubbles right up. So yeah, things are rolling around, but nothing specific to talk about. You're very sweet to ask. And if I did have a subject, I probably would just be out with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, are there other questions that perhaps people have?
We don't have any in the chat yet. People are also welcome to ask a question on camera if they want, if they don't mind being part of the YouTube recording. But perhaps while we're waiting for some audience questions, I would love to know, Barbara, there must have been a lot of great people who sort of wound up on the cutting room floor, people who you couldn't possibly, you can't fit everything. Are there any stories that you were particularly sad to let go of as you were working on this book?
It's funny how they all, they all kind of, it was 2 years of research and immersion into stories and people's stories, and people would come to me with their stories. And it was hard to select the final 12. And I think there were probably some hurt feelings that I didn't include some people. But no, I feel quite right with these 12. I wanted very strong ones, I wanted very powerful ones, and I wanted somewhat difficult ones. And that's what these held. I could talk a little bit, if you want, just a second, about some of the ones we haven't talked about who have been really, I think people would love to read about. One is, for instance, my friend Sue Klebold, whom I've known since she was a little girl, and she'll probably always be remembered as the mother of Dylan Klebold, the shooter in the Columbine killings. And for Sue, I've known her family forever. This was a very happy family. She, by all accounts, had absolutely no idea of what was afoot that day. And her whole world came crashing down in one day. Not only that her son was a murderer, but also that he had died. And what do we do? What do we do when everything falls apart in the matter of a few hours? And for her, the challenge was self-forgiveness. She said she had no problem in compassion for her son and forgiving her son just as a mother who loved her child, but forgiving herself now, I think 20 years later, has been really the struggle of her life. And she writes about it so poignantly. And she goes around the country now as an inspirational speaker to suicide prevention groups. And so how we can take circumstances like that and try and give them some meaning in our own lives and in other people's lives. It was wonderful being in touch with Sue again and hearing about that. Certainly the story of the Emmanuel 9 in Charleston, a young man who came in and shot the people joined in a prayer group, and how they instantly the next day offered forgiveness to him. Story of a young man who went into an Amish school in Pennsylvania and shot 10 young girls. And that evening, the Amish community came together and came to the house of the wife and parents of the shooter, bringing food and offering to pay for the funeral. How does that happen? How does it happen? There's no answer of how it happens, but to read about it and to get in closer touch with it does something to us. It does something to our sense of intention and wanting to bring that quality into our lives more. It's very freeing, certainly very freeing. The story of Amy Beale, who was a young Fulbright student in South Africa. The day before she was to come home, was shot and killed in a section of town that she said she felt comfortable being in, but she was the only white person there. So she was killed for being white. Her parents started the Amy Beale Foundation, working with South Africa, working with Bishop Tutu, and actually putting on the board of their foundation 2 of the people who were responsible for Amy's death, so that it wouldn't be in vain. I mean, how do we do that when a child is lost? It's extraordinary. But these stories are quite uplifting, and if there's even just a little spark in any of them that we can carry away, I will be a happy author.
It's wonderful. Yeah, very, very moving.
It really is. There's a question in the comment that this dovetails with nicely in the chat from Barry. He asks, "What in your opinion, what do you think are like the biggest obstacles to forgiveness?"
Oh dear, I think I know who wrote this question in, somebody who's just so exacting and wonderful. The obstacles are hanging on to, clinging to our own positions, clinging to our sense of being right, clinging to things having to be a certain way, not being able to let go, set it down, engage in a shift in our mind, open our hearts to greater compassion. That sounds so formulaic, but I really do mean it. I really think it's pretty simple. Not easy, just simple.
The way of letting go is through meditation, through other means. How does one go about it?
I'm not an expert, Barbara. Thank you for thinking I am.
You are. You're a teacher.
I think it's disentangling. You know, we get so tangled up in our own thoughts of what's right and how things must be, and who's wrong, and what's justified, and to take, for instance, this pause we've had of 4 months, to take a pause and perhaps assume a more reflective space in our lives, really reflective, without coming in with the fixed positions, trying to set those aside, even just to try to set them aside, can be very, very powerful. Yeah, I know I write about in the introduction in my own life, something that I really held on to for so long, somebody having done something very painful to me. And I thought, I'm never, ever going to be able to get rid of this or just move through it. And yet, and there wasn't a lightning bolt moment. It's really just with time and practice and putting myself in the other person's shoes. Quite often it must feel terrible to be the one who inflicts pain. Really, you know, it must feel terrible to be that way. I feel even that way, even about some political figures who are such haters. I don't want to get any closer to them, but it must feel terrible to be so consumed by hate and vengeance and vitriol. So it doesn't hurt to hang on to that thought.
Could I add a comment? Hi.
Hi.
My name's Beth, and I'm just so delighted that you're here doing this. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. Of course, like many others, I think when we see a book like this, we think, oh, I know who I want to give this to. And really, it's always the finger needs to come pointing back to ourselves. But on the idea of what the stumbling blocks are to being forgiving, I think it's so much being so loyal to our own story that we can't listen to another story. We can't even imagine another story. And the other stumbling block, I think, often is that we really want that person to be repentant.
Yes.
Then we'll grant the forgiveness. Well, so, and I come from the Christian tradition, so I wanted to ask a question regarding that and the religious look at all of this. In the Christian tradition, of course, there's grace, which is unmerited favor, and forgiveness is a huge piece of that. So if you're going to have that kind of grace extended to you, it's like better learn how to start extending that kind of grace or unmerited favor to others. And I don't really know that much about the Buddhist tradition. Is there any kind of teaching where the learner, the disciple of Buddhism, is granted forgiveness in such a way that it becomes something they want to emulate, or something that so fills them that it then comes bubbling over as something that then is going to go outward into the world?
Thank you for all you said. My goodness. And I'm so happy to hear the word grace brought up at this late moment, because I read so much on grace, and it's such a beautiful and important concept, and one that we don't really talk about that much. I mean, in secular life, but so many beautiful things are written on grace. Let me see if there's, I don't think there's anything that I want to say about Buddhism and forgiveness, really. There is no doctrine on it. My friend in Barry may see this differently, but I think compassion and letting go, and as you say, not hanging on to our own need to be right. And thank you for saying that that the book may. I see the book also as a gift to people when we can't actually want to have a conversation about forgiveness. It can be something we extend. Here, let me just give you this. That was certainly true with the generosity book. A lot of people gave the Inspiring Generosity as a gift of thanks to someone who had been very generous in their lives. And I was astonished to see that. I never realized that a book is a stand-in, really, for a conversation that maybe is either awkward or one you don't want to have, or can put a new spin on it. So I didn't really answer your question other than appreciate what you said, and particularly you're bringing up the subject of grace, which is such a beautiful subject.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to thank you so much, Barbara, for being here. It's time, and this has been a real pleasure. Barb, thanks for interviewing her. This has been wonderful.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, for sure.
Yes,
And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for being who you are and for writing this book. It's just amazing.
Wonderful to be with you. You're so appreciative. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you to our author and interviewer. This has been a really lovely evening. Thank you to the audience, and hopefully we will see you back again soon. We have a full slate of great Northshire Live events throughout the month of August. So come on back, and we'll see you all again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good
Thank you, Northshire. Thank you, Northshire.
Thank you, Northshire is right.
Thanks for being here.
Have a good week.